hypnotic recall of previous lives. Now I'm going to present you with 100% proof of reincarnation. This one is the trump card when it comes to evidentiary value. Consequently, I'll lay on quite a feast for you with this one, all with the approval of the author of the book and video in which the evidence is documented. This has to be the best book that I've read from an evidentiary point of view to do with reincarnation. It's a book written by psychologist and hypnotherapist Peter Ramstar called The Search for Lives Past. He tells of an Australian lady by the name of Gwen who allowed him to hypnotise her with a view to researching past lifetimes. She had no previous belief in reincarnation and had come to see Peter about an unrelated matter. She was one of dozens of participants in the research that Peter was conducting. She turned out to be a very good subject, was able to go into a deep hypnotic trance, and was able to give great detail about a life lived 200 years before in countryside England in the year 1780. The lady had never been to England during her current life in Australia. Peter made tapes of all trance sessions. Bear in mind at all times that none of her recall was in a conscious state. She was deeply hypnotised. You'll recall in an earlier chapter that I revealed that we have a new subconscious mind for each lifetime, so the memory could not be coming from the subconscious mind. We only have one unconscious mind for eternity, however, and it holds the memory of every one of the hundreds of lifetimes that we have each experienced. Therefore, the deep hypnotic trance had given Peter access to Gwen's unconscious mind. She talked whilst reliving this past life under hypnosis in an English accent and dialect, which was found to be quite authentic language of the era. She was able to describe the way of life, including dress, culture, cooking methods, all of which in research proved to be quite valid. She was able to name the people who lived in the houses in the immediate vicinity of hers. She gave the name of surrounding villages as Alford, Blaughton, Stonechapel, West Bradley and East Pennard. Her life had started in 1765 and ended in 1782 as a result of pneumonia. So she lived for only 17 years in that incarnation. Her father was Adam Duncan. Her stepmother was Bessie. Her life was one of happiness and contentment. Her father went away sometimes for weeks on end, so she shared her time with Bessie and an old man in a house close by called Dobbs. Walking was her normal mode of transport, and walking a few miles if she wished to go somewhere was quite normal. Her day would start with washing, dressing, plaiting her hair and having breakfast, generally porridge. After eating she would tidy up, make beds and do the washing. Her home was small, with about 4 rooms in total. Her chores included mending Mr. Dobbs' clothes and collecting vegetables for the dinner. A number of times in the week she would walk through the fields, cross the stream at the stepping stones and get provisions from the nearby village. She enjoyed seeing all the latest dresses and merchandise each time she visited. She had heard of the strife in America, which had become a popular topic of conversation. She went into great detail about how she would sneak out at night to watch the gypsies dancing in the woods. The woods featured as a main setting in her life. She used to find peace there and travelled through them to an old abbey that she loved, or to visit a druid's ring of stones. There was a local big house where the lords and gentry would entertain with parties and dinners. She used to sneak out at night and peek through the window to see the rich folk at play. The house was owned, she said, by a Scotsman called James Mackenzie. The old abbey was a ruin of a church, and she liked to play there. She described a spire like a castle which reached over the top of the trees. She described how one of the neighbours near the abbey, a Mr. Brown, had taken stones from the ruins of the abbey to put on the floor of his house. His house was about 20 feet from the stream. She described how she had cut her foot, and Mr. Brown had put her in his cart, which was loaded with stones from the abbey, and had bandaged her foot for her at his house. She had taken particular notice of the stones in Mr. Brown's cart because she didn't think that he had the right to take those stones for his flooring, even though the abbey was in ruins. The abbey became the central feature of her teenage years, with many fond memories. It was absolutely amazing how much detail that Peter was able to retrieve from her unconscious mind. She spoke of a curse that had been put on the Mackenzie clan by a Scotsman called Coinage O'Dahar, who was subsequently burnt at the stake. She spoke of a Lord Seaforth who lived in a castle in Bran. One day when she was approaching 18, her father said he had picked out a spouse for her. The young man, however, was part of the Mackenzie clan, who she despised. On hearing this, she ran away. She didn't want to leave home and get married. She didn't go home that night. Instead, she slept at the abbey. As the night wore on, she got freezing. By morning, she had exposure and frostbite. Her father eventually found her at the abbey, but by that time she was very ill. She had pneumonia and died 3 weeks later. She described her deathbed scene, how Bessie was crying. She was looking down on her body and wanted to say to Bessie, "Don't worry, I'm okay." But she realised she was dead and that Bessie couldn't hear her anymore. I was taken by a lady in that world and told to rest. But Bessie was pulling me back because she was grieving for me. I tried to tell her to let go, to not hold me back, but she couldn't hear me. After a time, she finally let go. Still in a trance, she explained how she was taken by an Egyptian-looking man who radiated light and love to a hall of records. It was explained to her that every detail of everyone's lifetimes are kept in this hall of records. This is often referred to as the Akashic Records, which is a part of cosmic memory. She was able to view her life's events in her mind to see where she had made right and wrong choices and decisions. It was explained to her that everyone must keep coming back to lifetimes on Earth until they had earned the right to stay in the higher levels through purification of their soul. After getting all this information from Gwen, in addition to others who took part in the survey, Peter decided to travel to England with a camera crew to document their search for evidence of the life of Rose Duncan in the late 1700s in the countryside of England. He explained in his book that Somerset was isolated away from the industrial areas, so they had the best chance possible of finding some evidence of Rose Duncan's life. He relates on page 63 of his book, "We hoped to fulfill the dream that had come to be the driving force for everyone working with me in the search for the truth about reincarnation." Gwen was glad to have the chance to see whether or not the places she remembered were truly factual. Gwen had never been outside of Australia, She didn't even have a passport, says Peter. She had never thought of past lives before coming to me. She now found herself going to the other side of the world to prove if her past life memory had a basis in fact. They were not sure of the location, but she had mentioned Langport, and it was that town that led to the countryside where she had lived. They looked over the map, located Langport and some of the villages that she had defined. Then some interesting facts became clear. Some of the villages that she had mentioned no longer existed. One place, which Gwen called Blorton, was today spelled Blotton. When they referred to old maps, however, they found that in 1770 the name of the village was Blorton. That is amazing. Stonechapel, another village she mentioned, didn't exist today, but did in 1782. All of the other villages she mentioned were there. Gwen had spoken of markets at a place she pronounced Crockham. When they checked, they found that there was a market in that area spelled Croscombe until 1782, but had not been there since. She had also mentioned the Severn Seas and Bleedon Hills. She also had mentioned Uphill, which they soon found on the map, then Bleedon Hills. They calculated that she must have lived somewhere in that area. Gwen had mentioned James Mackenzie, and on checking old library records of squires and gentry of the time, to their surprise, they found listed a James Mackenzie. Incredible. They also found records in the archives that made reference to a curse put on the Mackenzie clan by the seer known as Coinich Odar. She had also mentioned about a big house of James Mackenzie being remodelled by an architect named James Wyatt. Old records showed that a famous architect by that name had lived at that time. This was absolutely amazing, incredible evidence that was being retrieved here in this case, and, most importantly, the whole journey was documented in video, which is still available on the internet through Peter's website. It was obviously a part of her destiny to retrieve these memories on behalf of humanity as evidence to be presented in a later life in the 20th century. She has played an important part in transforming the belief patterns of those who are on the crest of the wave of evolution, such as you. Gwen had used the word tallet to describe under hypnosis a room in her house. It's not a word in current dictionaries, but research in local English libraries revealed that it was a word used at that time to describe a loft in the roof area. Another thing that she had described were regular meetings of Quakers in the local area. This was confirmed when a reference to these meetings was found in an old newspaper of the time. They found that in records in London about Quaker meetings of the time, it was only major meetings that had been mentioned, so it was only a fluke that insignificant meetings in remote country areas like Somerset County were able to be verified at all. Peter says in his book on page 82, how could Gwen have known about these small religious meetings which took place in an obscure little village in Somerset 200 years ago? She had never been outside of Australia, and even an historian would not have known that. We were all satisfied with the discovery." Unquote. Gwen had spoken of the ruins of the abbey, particularly the arches of the buildings and the feathers that were etched in the stones that made up the arches and the sides of the doors. Peter said he gave Gwen an old unmarked map of the area and asked if she could identify where the abbey was. Gwen looked for a moment, then pointed near Weary Hall Hill. She was correct. She had pinpointed Glastonbury Abbey precisely. Another important point is this. The only reason that Gwen could retrieve these details from her unconscious mind whilst still in a waking state is that Peter had given her subconscious mind what's called a post-hypnotic suggestion, that she would remember these details when on site, in the waking state. Without that suggestion, she would not have had access to these memories from the unconscious mind. That's why we ordinarily have no recall of past lives, because we have a new subconscious mind in each lifetime. We're protected in that way from the memory of past lives, because that recall would be too overwhelming to the conscious mind. We have enough bad memories to cope with from this current lifetime without having the burden of foul deeds from past lives. The entire conversation was conducted in a private house with an historian from the University of Bristol present. He agreed to act as a witness during the expedition into the area. She described the river in the map, shapes of hills in the area, and a great building on top of the hill where stones were, that had bloodstains on them from blood of sacrificed chickens. She pointed to an area where the building with the feathers engraved on the stones could be found, and said there were 2 small pyramids. She described an old inn in the area. She said all this in a state of hypnosis, speaking as Rose Duncan. At this point the historian interjected and asked Gwen to describe the pyramids. Just imagine the situation. They had an historian, and they're historically atheistic in their thinking, and he would have been a skeptic of the first order of all of this business going on about reincarnation. And at this point the historian interjected and asked Gwen to describe the pyramids, and he extracted a detailed description from Gwen about the location and shape of the 2 pyramids. They finally took Gwen to the area on the map and blindfolded her when they got close. They then removed the blindfold. As her vision cleared, she saw herself standing outside the abbey. The ruins of the abbey were still intact after 200 years. Gwen was visibly shaken. To be in the place where she had loved to play as a child 200 years ago. She did find the feathers on the doorway. She became very animated. Sitting on the very same rock where she had sat as Rose Duncan, she reminisced about her life from 1765 to 1782. She spoke of the pyramids that were no longer there and pointed to doorways that had crumbled. She walked to the doorway of one building and pointed to an area on the side of the archway. There's 3 little plumes up there, you see, on the top up there, like 3 feathers. Once she had had her fill of memories at the abbey, they took Gwen to meet a local historian who was an expert on the local area. The historian confirmed after talking with Gwen about local legends that she remembered that indeed they were true legends of the time, and that she could never have read anything about those legends in modern literature. So this is amazing. Here we've got 2 historians, which would have to be the greatest skeptics of all time about these sort of things. She's unravelling mysteries from the past that they end up having to confirm. Gwen spoke to him of the activities of the local Druids, a religious sect in the area, their type of dress and mannerisms. Again, all of this was confirmed by the historian. Of this, Peter says on page 95, "I thought them amazing facts for Gwen to know. How could she know that a particular religious group met once a year on a particular hill in Somerset over 200 years ago? She also described the 2 pyramids, and the local historian confirmed that there were 2 pyramids there, and modern archaeologists had found the remains of one by digging. Once again, Gwen had been correct. For Gwen, and indeed all of us, it had been an incredible experience." Peter recalls on page 97, "When we commenced with this research, Gwen had come to see me through events that were not of her own design. At that time she didn't know of any past life, nor did she believe in one. When told that under hypnosis she was recalling a past life, she was surprised. By visiting Somerset, Gwen knew that she had lived before and was home in the place of her former life." Unquote. Now it was time to find her old house. They took her blindfolded so she couldn't get her bearings. She led them to a spot where she thought the house used to be. There was the ruin of an old house and a couple of brand new houses nearby. They approached the front of the house to ask permission of the owner to investigate. In conversation he stated that his house was originally built in 1742. He confirmed that there used to be a cider house in the area, which confirmed what Gwen had said. More startling evidence had been found that Gwen could not have possibly known. Now they were out to find the house where Gwen had lived. Gwen led the way, and it wasn't long before they reached the stream, exactly as Gwen had predicted. It was the size she had predicted, and by now the whole team was elated. On page 100, Peter relates, "Most everyone in our group wanted to believe, but there were doubts. These doubts, however, still niggled the back of the mind and detracted from the certainty. Yet each day our doubts were dispersing and our beliefs were being strengthened. We wrestled with our minds and our beliefs, finding it difficult to comprehend the enormity of what was happening and the ramifications of what we were proving. Slowly one felt the need to accept wholeheartedly it was something supernormal, something supreme, something about the universe and our destinies which only made us feel all the smaller. Most of us were both moved and somehow changed by the experience, and we began to feel aware of a growing confidence in what we were doing." Unquote. This is absolutely amazing evidence that I'm presenting here for you. Thanks to Peter Ramster. Finally they reached the fork in the stream just as Gwen had indicated. Above the fork was a waterfall she had described. Gwen knew they were now close to her house. She ran across the fields and pointed to where old Dobbs had lived. She then pointed to the top of her house, obscured by trees, a few hundred yards away. They finally approached the front of the house. Gwen was at first a little confused, as there had been a few changes to the house in the 200 years since her life as Rose Duncan. The thatch roof had been replaced by tiles. The part that used to be her home was now attached to a larger, newer house. Her old home had become a garage and unused pigsty. She had described the door as being off-centre whilst in hypnosis in Australia, and she was correct. It was off-centre. The old house was still intact, even though not lived in anymore. Before they went around the back of the house, they asked Gwen to sketch the rear. She did so using Peter's back to support the paper. As they approached the back, they were all amazed to see that it was exactly as Gwen had described. Tallet, that's the loft, and all. Gwen suddenly burst into tears. Quoting from page 104 of Peter's book, she was back at her home in Somerset after all these long years. She had virtually forgotten the place existed for a period of 3 lifetimes. The rediscovery and the knowledge that she had succeeded brought a torrent of emotion. She was at once both in the past and in the present, with the certain knowledge that she would live again in the future. By this time we had lost all doubt. It meant a new appraisal for us, a new understanding." Unquote. So by what was in there, it's obvious that Peter had uncovered 3 lifetimes that had occurred in the intervening period since Gwen died as Rose Duncan 200 years ago, and the current life that she was in. They asked permission of the current owner to go inside. The floor was stone, it had a tallet, and there was a drying room out the back exactly as Gwen had described. Another incredible achievement. Peter states on page 105, Gwen's discoveries were inspiring, yet we were still having difficulty comprehending the enormity of it all. Unquote. Yet the most incredible find was yet to come. In Sydney, whilst under hypnosis, Gwen had reported noticing a stone with special markings on it in the back of a neighbour Brown's cart, when he had given her a ride and bandaged her cut foot. Gwen described the markings on the stone as a spiral on the right and a shape like the top of a map of Scotland on the left. Whilst in Sydney and under hypnosis, she was asked to draw those markings. She also made a rough drawing of an inn that she called Pilgrim's Inn. They now set out to locate Mr. Brown's house. She led them first to the inn, which was no longer called Pilgrim's Inn, but was called the George and Pilgrim. A quick check, however, revealed that it had been called the Pilgrim's Inn in the 18th century. Peter says on page 108, the inn stood exactly as she had described it in Sydney. It was built of sandy-coloured stones, had 2 points in the roof, and an opening in the middle through which coaches used to pass. Gwen exclaimed, "No different, is it? You wouldn't believe it, would you?" Unquote. They were worried as they approached the area where the 5 houses had been, including Mr. Brown's, that the places would have been demolished by now after 200 years. Peter says on page 109, 200 years is a long time. It was unlikely they could have remained intact. We were there to find out. This was the end of the search. After all that Gwen had achieved, if it could be verified, it would be the crowning glory. We were all very tired." Unquote. A lot had changed in that particular area, and they were concerned as Gwen tried to unravel the maze of new roads and buildings. "If Gwen could find the cottages, we would consider it a tremendous feat," remarked Peter. Gwen found the stream and pointed to a dilapidated building. "That's it! I'm sure that's it!" she cried. When they looked closely, they found that it was only a chicken shed. They peered in and saw that the floor of the shed was covered with chicken droppings. They found the owner, who lived nearby, and asked him about the history of the place. He sent them to the man who had owned it previously. He confirmed that there had indeed been 5 houses at that site, and that included the house Gwen had described. Time had taken its toll on the 5 houses, and eventually they were all unsafe for living in. They were turned into one long chicken shed. Eventually the end cottages were pulled down altogether, and only part of the original buildings now remained. Fortunately, Mr. Brown's cottage was one of the middle ones, so it constituted part of the shed that now was left standing after 200 years. They were now looking for the Holy Grail of evidence. If they could find those stones under the decades of chicken droppings, especially the one that Gwen had drawn in Sydney, it would be irrefutable proof of the truth of reincarnation. They asked the owner if they could come back next morning, clear the chicken droppings from the floor, and loosen what they expected would be the stones on the floor. The owner agreed, and even said he would help. They came back the next day to finalise the journey that had rocked every member to their roots. They duly removed the chicken droppings, found the stones on the floor, and even found the Holy Grail, the Stone of Stones. the one that Gwen had seen 200 years ago as a young girl in the back of a neighbour's cart. As Rose Duncan, she had cut her foot, and Destiny had seen her notice the markings on a stone. She was marked for greatness in a life 200 years later in Australia. She would play an important role in the destiny of humanity. That is absolutely amazing. Peter takes up the story on page 111, quote, "We had already explained to the property owners why we were there. They seemed bewildered by our activities and probably thought we were all a bit mad. After all, it's not every day that a group of people from the other side of the world want to look at the floor of your chicken shed. However, they humoured us and we told them about the markings on the stone we were now looking for. Gwen, the owner and family, the entire film crew and I entered the overcrowded shed for the final scrutiny." The chicken droppings had been removed previously by the owners at the request of the investigative team. Peter says, "Gwen surveyed them all and then pointed to one. We levered the stone out. After a further wash, we could see the markings more clearly. Comparing the stone to Gwen's drawings, the similarity was obvious. The markings that Gwen had drawn on the left-hand side of the stone were like a map of the lines of the top of Scotland, and the large spiral was on the right-hand side of the stone. It was a remarkable find. As well as the hill, the stream, the cottages, and the abbey stones, Gwen had found the very stone that she had drawn in Sydney, a feat far beyond any elements of chance. We were lucky that after all this time it was still there. For me, and of course Gwen, all doubts about reincarnation had been dispelled. Instead, due to the indisputable evidence put before us, there was a belief. I felt privileged to have been a part of the search we had undertaken." Unquote. You'll find a photograph of that stone at the end of this chapter. The whole episode was made into a documentary film, and all the evidence of this incredible journey is recorded and kept. It is a remarkable contribution to the evolution of human consciousness into the coming new age. It's been a great pleasure to present here for you such irrefutable evidence for the fact that God, Goddess, all that is, loves us all so much that they have given us all eternal life. We can never, ever die. I mean, how else could that evidence be interpreted? The fact that not only was this evidence unearthed, the whole expedition, as well as others by Peter into France and Germany, has been documented by Peter Ramster in a video, which is now available through the internet in DVD format. Peter obviously went to a lot of expense by taking Gwen, other women involved in the experiment, plus a film crew to document every part of the adventure on a journey to the other side of the globe. He did all that on behalf of humanity to provide 100% proof of the fact that God has granted us the gift of eternal life. It's time to really let it in. You have an eternal journey ahead of you. A journey of eternally becoming more of who you really are.